This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's A-A-S-A, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm a member and you can become one too. Membership is very reasonably priced and comes with a range of benefits. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a great collection of books about animal studies. Today we're going to talk about animal studies pedagogy. Those of you who teach on human-animal studies will find lots of valuable work in the Animal Publics book series. I encourage you to take a look through the titles on the Sydney University Press website. And also a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Today I'm very pleased to introduce you to an academic I met at the Mancept Workshops in Political Theory in 2022, where I co-host an annual workshop on animal politics. Liza Bauer is a PhD candidate in literature at the University of Giessen in Germany, as well as the manager of the Panel on Planetary Thinking project at Giessen. Her dissertation, Livestock in the Laboratory of Literature, explores literary visions of human-animal relationships as thought experiments for novel political futures. She's published widely on human-animal studies in both English and German, and today we're going to talk about her work on animal studies pedagogy. Liza's paper, Reading to Stretch the Imagination, Exploring Representations of Livestock in Literary Thought Experiments, was published in the open access book Multispecies Futures, New Approaches to Teaching Human-Animal Studies, edited by Andreas Hübner, Micha Gerrit Philipp Edlich, and Maria Moss, and it was published by Neofelis in 2022. The paper was based on an earlier German language paper by Liza in Simone Horstmann's Interspezies Lernen, which was published by Transcript in 2021. Welcome to the podcast, Liza.
I'm happy to be here.
So can you start by telling us what led you to writing this chapter?
Actually, the idea came to me while I was writing the introduction to my PhD thesis, because this was actually a couple of years ago, and I was encouraged in a colloquium to write a roadmap for my project in order to figure out where my focus is. And in the course of writing this introduction, I opened it with a passage that is presumably written from a laying hen's perspective. So she is rendering her experience within a battery cage from the first person perspective. And it's obviously, this is a really distressing passage, as one could imagine. And then I contrasted that with another passage from a speculative fiction novel, Margaret Atwood's Oryx at Craig, and I contrasted this to the chicky knobs that she creates there. The chicky knobs are a biotech creature, and they have really large breasts and multiple drumsticks, but no heads. And they are described as the utilitarian stream creature. So what intrigued me about this juxtaposition was, okay, there is a text about a chicken in speculative fiction, and there's a text about a chicken in a novel that's narrating in perhaps more conventional way of storytelling. But both of them do not really deliver much in terms of how to imagine our relationship to a laying hen differently than via exploitation, right? So I was curious because I thought, I know that I want to focus on speculative fiction because I know there are some novels that do interesting things in terms of imagining so-called livestock animals. But what is it actually that makes them so interesting? And what makes them so intriguing? And so then I encountered this idea of the thought experiments that speculative fiction plays through. And I encountered some work by narratologists, Brian McHale, or by philosopher Kathleen Elgin, and also Donna Haraway, who've been doing a lot of research on the capacity of literary fictional texts to create new worlds that follow different parameters. And so So I thought, okay, let's do more research on how these speculative fiction worlds actually reimagine our relationship to so-called livestock, and let's see what we can find, and let's see whether there's actually something that goes beyond a chicky knob that is only breast meat or drumstick meat, or beyond a laying hen that is just delivering the readers a vision of distress and sadness.
I see. So you're looking at science fiction and speculative fiction in particular because these are the forms of fiction that offer us a vision of a world that's quite far removed from our own. So they're the ones that can offer us a real thought experiment. Is that correct?
Yes, in a way, because I felt like perhaps our imagination is in something like a dead-end street when it comes to imagining our roles in opposition to the roles of livestock animals, in a manner that does not use them, in a manner that sees them as our kin or potentially our collaborators. Of course, these fictional worlds are also always based upon the real world as well. So they pick up on aspects from reality, and then they estrange us from these aspects. And then they trigger our imagination to stretch a little bit too far. And often then they imagine really impossible worlds. And maybe it might lead our imagination off a little too far, like it happens with the chicky knobs, or as it happens in other novels where animals suddenly declare war against humankind, and all kinds of violence breaks loose again. So maybe we are led a bit too far and we do not end up in a harmonious vision. But maybe this is the way in which we can figure out how far we actually have to go in terms of reimagining our relationships to non-human animals.
I think one of the recurring challenges for scholars of literary animal studies is about the relationship between fictional animals that they study in texts and real animals out there in the real world. Now, you take a very clear stance on this. You write that the study of literary animal representations needs to connect to living animals in a meaningful way. What do you mean by that?
By that I mean that it should connect to living animals on the one hand in a way that acknowledges our anthropocentric bias, so that acknowledges that of course every representation of an animal is human made and is also always an anthropomorphization. So we always put something of the human inside an animal representation, and we have to be aware of that, of course. But at the same time, it also doesn't deliver animal studies scholars a lot if we only look at these as signs. If we do not acknowledge that there are traces of the real animals within the sign or within the symbol, then they are utterly disconnected from the real animals beyond the page. And I think this is one thing that we really need to teach students to understand, because there are very well-known examples about how the representations of animals have impacted the lives of real animals. There are negative and positive examples for that. In Germany, we have this really well-known fairy tale. I think the English title is Little Red Riding Hood. So the stereotype of the big bad wolf and what is connected with it, and how wolves suffered from this bad image that they have. And very similar things happened with sharks after the movie Jaws, of course. And then there's positive examples, like after the film version of Babe the Sheep Pig came out, there was actually a stagnant demand for pork in 1995 when the movie came out, or after Black Beauty was published, there were some initiatives for horse welfare. So these texts actually do impact the lives of real animals. So there's this one very obvious connection. And I think this is something that is really accessible for students to understand at the onset. And this is the one side of the equation. But then the other side of the equation is also that if we represent an animal, and even if it is a symbol for human meaning, then this symbol is still not disconnected from the material traces of the animal. So even if we portray a squirrel in a poem, as there's this famous anecdote that Susan McHugh refers to, that when she reads the Wordsworth poem and she says, okay, perhaps the poem is meant to be written from the perspective of a squirrel. And then her teacher says, squirrels don't write poetry and they don't think, right? And of course, perhaps this squirrel is intended as a symbol for some human meaning in terms of provide for the future or something along these lines. But whether we want it or not, the symbol that we create is also bears the traces of a material, real life squirrel. So there's two sides of meaning coming into the mix. On the one hand, there are the material traces of real animals, and on the other hand, there are all the symbolic meanings and the associations that we have with this animal. And these come into the mix. And then in animal studies, in literary animal studies, we talk about material semiotic hybrids. So this is where these hybrids come in. So textual animals are material semiotic hybrids, and they again react back upon the living conditions of real animals. And then the challenge is, of course, how do we transport this to students? How do we make them understand? And how do we translate this into meaningful lessons that are also relatable for students of different levels?
Yes, and so that was going to be my next question. What kinds of methods can we deploy in the classroom to help students connect these texts to real, material, living animals?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I've thought a lot about this, and also scholars on animal pedagogy have thought a lot about this. And one really obvious way is, of course, to actually bring the real animals into the conversation. So especially with younger students, I think really engaging tasks are writing diaries about which animals they encounter in their daily lives outside of the classroom. So just paying attention to how many animals they actually encounter in their daily lives without noticing it and noting it down, bringing that to class and talking about that. This is one of the really well-known strategies already. Then, of course, you can also take the class to an excursion. You can visit farms, or you can visit animal sanctuaries, or of course you could also take animals into the classroom, even though this can of course be seen really critical. I remember when I was in kindergarten and it was bring your dog day, and then I was of course really intrigued by that, but I was not taught about the problematic aspects of dragging the dog into a classroom full of children and making him all excited, of course. And this is something that we always have to be aware of. So I think one potential about literary texts and about literary animal studies is that they can actually do without directly involving the real animals. So by explaining the students about what I've just explained about the material semiotic hybridity of textual animals, we can actually connect the teaching of literature to concerns that are connected to real animals. For example, if the text addresses violence against animals, it could be connected to a discussion on animal ethics, or it can be connected to informative readings on strategies and on breeding techniques of animals. So one could really take the text, take the themes that are addressed by this text, and then use this as an inspiration to get the students informed about what is actually happening in the real world to real animals, and then discuss, exchange opinions, share experiences, or also encourage them to talk with their parents about this, to talk with their friends about what they read and what other people in their real lives think. And then perhaps they can also relate this to their experience to the real animals they meet. Perhaps they even encounter a pig, or they encounter a cow, or more probably they would encounter a cat or a dog that they share their homes with, and then they could reflect on whether they would see or think about this animal differently than before. So there are numerous ways in which one could bring the alive animals into the classroom without actually bringing them in and without dragging them in there against their will and engaging in yet another form of animal commodification or objectification for the sake of teaching them not to objectify it.
Do you think it's important to focus on so-called livestock animals in particular?
Yes, an answer to this would be a clear yes, and this is for various reasons, of course. I mean, the most obvious of which is, of course, that the crisis in which our planet is at the moment has urgently called for a long, long time that we need to drastically reduce animal industries all over the world, and the disastrous ecological footprint of the industry really forces us actually for a long, long time already to reduce our consumption of animal products and to find ways find new ways of cohabiting the planet alongside with other animals. And this, of course, adheres to other animal species as well, but those ones that we use for many products are obviously the ones that are most directly linked to that theme. So this is the first really pragmatic reason, perhaps, for which I think it's important to focus on them. And then another one is also focuses a bit more on the emotional side of things, because I feel like among all the animal species with whom humans have shared the world throughout history, it's cows and pigs and chickens with whom they have collaborated most closely, most intensively. So in a way, these animals in particular can be seen as the animal species that are the most concrete co-creators of our societal lives. I mean, recently I heard about the turnspit dog. Have you heard about this before?
No.
The turnspit dog, apparently, there was a time when dogs were used in kitchens to turn spikes to get the meat grilled on a medium level. So I've just heard about this two days ago. So also dogs apparently were used for similar reasons than livestock animals. But I think for this reason that we have that these animals are the ones who endure the most striking and drastic violence. And this is something that has always happened. And at the same time, they have been such close kins to humans, to human societies. This, of course, emerges in most striking cognitive dissonances between human consumers and animals, because we've always been so close to them. But at the same time, we also had to withdraw from them. We also had to detach ourselves from them in order to continuously justify to keep on doing this. So I feel like reimagining our relationships to particularly livestock animals is also something of great psychological benefit to humans, particularly to young students, because I remember many children feel really close to animals. I know many children from my social circle who actually from themselves would not like to eat meat, because as soon as they understand where it comes from, and then they are continuously trained to unlearn this empathy and to unlearn the sympathy for animals. And a vital task, I feel, is to relearn what we actually know from our hearts, probably, that these are subjective beings and that they can be as close to us as our beloved dog can be.
You mentioned before about how teachers of literary animal studies should be ready to address questions of animal ethics. I'm going to break one of my rules now and mention my own work. But in some of my published work, which is aimed at literary audiences, I've argued that scholars of vegan studies should be ready to engage directly with animal ethical work in their teaching and learning and research. So I suppose my question is, do you think that teachers of literary animal studies should be asking students to read animal ethics in addition to more standard literary texts?
Now, that's a great idea, actually, because I feel it also connects to the earlier question you had about strategies of bringing the real animals into dialogue. Because animal ethics texts are intrinsically about real animals. Of course, they also use animal representations. So in a way, they can also be seen, like from a literary animal studies perspective, they are also poetic forms. They are also not purely representatives of the real animals. They also have the semiotic meanings in there, but they do address issues that concern real animals. So I feel there are two ways of incorporating this in teaching models. On the one hand, there are animal texts in which animal ethics agendas or meanings or messages are being expressed, and this could either take place through a character within a novel who is an animal ethicist and voices a particular message, or this could also just take place more covertly via representing these issues and bringing these messages to the fore. I could imagine that for students, it would be really helpful actually to get a groundwork on animal ethics before they enter a text like this. They get some readings on the basis of animal ethics, and then they read the text, and then they can draw conclusions, connections. They can learn how to critically engage with both the animal ethics texts and the novel, and see which kind of messages are brought forth, Or they could also see, this again connects to thought experiments actually, because if a novel conducts a thought experiment on what if an animal ethicist was working at a meat factory, for example, and then they play out what this could imply, and this can trigger critical reflection on animal ethics agendas, and they would also learn to remain critical of the text and not to believe everything they say, and also to learn to actually engage with what scholars have been saying and what scholars have been arguing, and which benefits result from that and which don't.
In your chapter, you draw upon 3 examples of science fiction texts that offer particularly interesting possibilities for thinking about human-animal relationships in the classroom. They're Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, Sue Burke's Semiosis, and Gene Stone and John Doyle's The Awareness. So why do you think that these texts in particular are valuable for teaching purposes?
I selected these 3 because each of them can be seen as representative of particular affordances that speculative fiction work carry along in terms of human animals, in terms of communicating human animal studies insights. And to start with Atwood, I already mentioned the chicky knobs at the beginning, and I mentioned that they don't deliver that much in terms of reimagining a hopeful vision. But Atwood also imagines the pigoons, and these pigoons are really insightful characters from many, many different reasons. And I think the most central lesson that students could learn through the pigoons is that the way human characters perceive these pigs shifts throughout the story. So Margaret Atwood it's actually a trilogy. So in each novel is narrated by a different human character, and each novel also portrays different versions of the future world that Atwood speculates upon. And in one of these versions, the pigoons are biotech pigs who are really intelligent and really large, and they have been bred in order to grow replacement organs within their bodies for humans. So they are really, really large, massive pigs, and they look really scary for the human character because they have really human-like faces, because they have some human DNA within their brains. So the characters already notice that these pigs are really similar to them. And this is also for a reason, because the organs are supposed to be transplanted into human bodies, of course. So the humans fear the pigoons, but still they see them as organ resources, and they clearly talk about them as if they were objects. They are all really well hidden behind massive biotech companies, and so they don't pose a threat to the humans yet. They are objects, but they are also feared. So there's this threatening kind of agency that's already lurking behind the gates, but everything is still secure. So this is the first scenario. But then the human infrastructure breaks down. That means the pigoons run freely, and the pigoons suddenly become the antagonists of the human survivors of the dystopian scenario. And then readers of the novel, they already notice how the human characters slowly perceive these pigs differently. So they slowly start recognizing the intelligence that lies behind these massive pigs, and also the danger, the threat that these pigs pose to their human lives. So this is the intermediary state where they slowly start to recognize these as subjective beings who make their own plans, who start to calculate, and who strategically attack the humans. And in the third part, they form a pact, they make peace with the pigoons, and they form actually a multispecies society, and they negotiate with them, and they become social agents. And I think while readers read these 3 novels and they project themselves within the perspective of the human characters, they are invited to undergo these imaginary shifts of the character. And while undergoing these imaginary shifts, they might start reflecting about how these perceptions can shift in the real world as well. So they could start reflecting on how to perceive a pig differently from, perhaps they would take a pig as a pet, and then they notice how the pig learns from and with them, and how a pig is able to become a family member actually, and to shift in their role. And I think that this idea of species categories being being flexible, being culturally specific and not being set in stone and being able to undergo shifts is a really central lesson. Students could also reflect afterwards on how they speak about animals. And I address several more of these questions in the text. I probably shouldn't go into too much detail here, but I think this is the most outstanding aspects about Edward Spiegun's. Coming to Sue Berg's novel Semiosis. So here, this is a really different strategy, because here the focus is much less on the livestock animals in themselves, but it's much more on the relationships and the reciprocity of domestication processes. So the big advantage of this novel is that it's actually set on a different planet. So we have not only a speculative fiction world, but we have an entirely new planet. So there's even more boundary breaking possible on this fantastic planet. And on this planet, the plants have central nervous systems. So the plants are really intelligent. And then there's this one character in the novel who's a rainbow bamboo, and the rainbow bamboo domesticates the settling humans. So what readers gain here is an outsider's perspective on a domestication process and a plant who actually describes the humans as animals. So they are invited to undergo reflections on how to give back to nature, how to foster reciprocity in human-nature relationships. And this is also beyond the pure perspective on animal studies, also in terms of multi-species studies, in terms of how to incorporate indigenous cosmologies and views on sustainability. I think the novel offers lots of insightful lessons on how to shift perspective and just showing also that there's not one boundary that separates the human animals from all other animal species, but there are in fact very, very many different kinds of boundaries between different species. And I think this is a really insightful lesson for students as well. Coming to the last novel, Stone and Doyle's The Awareness it's one of these extreme thought experiments where you have lots of warfare in the end. So you don't really feel like there is any peace coming out of that. But one thing that makes the novel really interesting is that it engages so deeply with anthropomorphization. So it really shows students that whenever we portray animals' perspectives, we can only ever portray them through human terms. So we cannot overcome our anthropocentric perspective. And I feel this is a really central lesson for young people, especially, and for people who like animals, because often, we share our homes and our lives with so many animals, and we try to make sense of them, and we cannot not anthropomorphize while doing that. And I think it's really important that we continuously question what we believe our animals need, or what our animals think, or what they want. If we always try and if we are always self-critical, then we can move towards actually understanding the needs of the other animals. And this also connects to the second aspect why Stone and Doyle's novel is interesting, because it focalizes the story through a bear, a dog, an elephant, and a pig. So there's this spectrum of different categories of animals that it reflects upon as well. So it addresses on the one hand this question of anthropomorphization, and at the same time it touches upon the theme of speciesism, of the lines that we draw not only between the human animal and all other animals, but also between the different categories of animals that we attribute to them and that are undergoing shifts and that resolve in different ethical stances that we experience and formulate towards them.
Now, Lisa, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes, I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
That would clearly be Erica Fudge's Perceiving Animals, Humans and Beasts in Early Modern English Culture, I assume, because I encountered that while writing my BA thesis at the University of Marburg back in 2014. And this piece was still a bit of a naive piece of scholarship. Of course, it was my BA thesis, but it was about shifting human-animal relations from the early modern to the Romantic period in English poetry and prose. And when I encountered Erica Fudge's work, I was deeply shocked, but at the same time really fascinated when I read her analysis of the early modern spectacles taking place in the bear baiting arena. And I remember her terming bear baiting both the most spectacular representation of human dominion in early modern England and also the most spectacular representation of humanity's failure to establish its own humanness. And I was really intrigued by that. And this was the first time I encountered the discipline of human animal studies. And I got really inspired by that, because my idea to write the BA thesis was mainly because I was interested in doing something on animals, and then noticing, oh, there's actually a whole discipline about that. So maybe I'll continue and follow up on this.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
So as I've just already mentioned, my BA thesis, which is probably the first one I wrote, I would say that my first published piece of writing would then be an analysis of romantic animal poetry with a focus on William Blake's collections, Songs of Innocence and Experience, which was published in 1789. So a small monograph version of this was entitled "Am Not I a Fly Like Thee?" Which is also a quote by Blake. It's from one of his animal poems in this collection, where a lyrical persona implies kinship with a fly. And I was really intrigued back then by this sudden shift that the attention that romantic writers directed towards the suffering of animals and towards the kinship between humans and non-human animals. And I noticed this, how stark of a contrast to the Enlightenment period that was. And this is basically what this first piece of writing from me is about.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I think here I'd clearly name Roland Borgert, who is the German literary scholar who has shaped the descriptive analytical approach called cultural and literary animal studies, and which is also really widespread here in Germany. Because encountering him was really crucial for me developing my PhD thesis, because back home at my university, I did not have any animal studies expert on whose expertise to rely on. So I was really lucky that my supervisor recommended Roland Borgert's Cultural Handbook on Animals to me. And then I established contact with him because he's located in Frankfurt, which is not too far from here. And there I joined his animal studies colloquium and learned a lot. So the most profound one of these lessons, I think, was to maintain a certain analytical distance while reading and analyzing animal texts. And by this, I don't mean being indifferent to animals, of course, but in a sense of doing scholarly work always in a self-reflective and self-critical manner, because it means that I always only try to argue as much as I, as a human literary scholar, actually can do and have the tools for and evidence for, without jumping to quick conclusions and then lose credibility. And I think this is really important, especially if you deal with livestock animals and with animals in particular, because things often get so emotional. And I experienced how I grew more and more attached to cows and pigs and chickens while I was doing my research. But it was a bit of a challenge often for me to remain objective and remain analytical and argue with force in terms of, so that my ethical political objectives do not cloud the analysis too far.
And that links very neatly to the next question, which is, what do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Yeah, I think for me, as I'm still at the start of my career, I would align with what many other people have said on this podcast, that we have to work towards further institutionalizing animal studies. It seems to be one of the central and realistic things we can do, but I also feel like it's really, really vital, and perhaps even more, to communicate our work to the public and to carry it out of the ivory tower of academia. Because while it's incredible how rapidly the field seems to be expanding already, there obviously remains a certain resistance against the field in more conservative surroundings, and not only at universities, but also at schools. And I experienced it myself during my PhD. And also recently, I read a really interesting article by John Drew that appeared in the Human Animalia journal. And there he argues that we really need to challenge the anthropo-allegorical in literary and pedagogical discourse and practice, because he considers that hegemonic approaches to education continue to perpetuate the persistence of human exceptionalism. And I found this article really, really convincing, and I think this is really where we must intervene. So we need to vigorously argue for incorporating animals in curriculums, not only in universities but also at schools. And we need to vigorously and attentively work towards bringing animals into all kinds of conversations. So meaning also in our homes, with our friends, with our families. And we should not be tired of perhaps sometimes going onto someone's nerves if we have to bring up this issue again and again, because this is the only way how we can enact some change. And during the last couple of years, I've really noticed this drastic increase of attention to animal questions already. But obviously, this is also something that is connected to the bubbles in which we live, right? So the realities for animals is still that they are on the peripheries of public attention. So we are small pieces of the puzzle, and we have to really work towards making these pieces a little larger.
And a question that speaks directly to your interest in speculative fiction and literary thought experiments. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
First, I wanted to say, let humans and animals find a way to understand each other. But I guess you hear that so many times in this podcast, so I thought a little more deeply about that one. And I guess if I had superpowers, I would see to it that the flesh and other bodily substances of animals became unpalatable to humans.
I like it.
Yeah. Because and of course I'd say unpalatable instead of inedible, because so many dystopian novels like Tender as the Flesh by Augustina Basterica or Meat by Joseph de Lacy have acted out how horrific that scenario could turn out. For, of course, once food gets scarce in dystopian futures, humans might start eating other humans and treat these rather similarly as we are now treating animals. And also with regards to the real world, there are many indigenous communities, of course, whose survival still depends on hunting practices. So I had the idea to, in order to mitigate this potential side effect, I thought about the luck of swans, whose flesh I once heard would taste rather unpleasant, so they were never really domesticated for consumption reasons. But sadly, I mean, if we change the taste of pig meat or cow's milk at our current point of history, this would probably not change too much about the situation. Merely the scale would perhaps be reduced a bit, but I guess if we really want to follow through with it, I would have to move far back in time and change that before the entire disaster even started.
What are you working on next?
I have a couple of projects that I'm working on right now. The most immediate of which is a collaborative chapter on biotechnologically animal speech in sci-fi texts. This one will appear in Nora Castle and Julia Champion's collected work on animals in science fiction in 2023. I believe she was also on the podcast here once.
She was, yes.
Yes. Plus, I'm preparing my PhD dissertation for publication. At the moment, my first sample chapters are in the process of peer reviewing at the Board of Palgrave Studies in Animals and Literature, so I'm really excited about that. And in the long run, I would like to steer my research more towards multispecies studies and look into indigenous cosmologies and animal sanctuaries. So this is kind of where I'm steering my research at the moment.
How can people find out more about your work?
You can find my academic profile and including my list of publications on the website of the panel on Planetary Thinking, which I'm currently the manager of. And searching for JLU Giessen and Planetary Thinking will easily get you to this profile. Then also, even though it's perhaps not the most attractive option any longer, but of course you can follow me on Twitter. My handle there is Liza Bauer 1, or also the panel's handle, which is Planetary Panel. And of course, you can always contact me via email directly if you'd like to find out more, because I'm always happy to talk about animal-related questions next to the administrative tasks that I'm performing at the moment. So I'd be really happy if anyone who's hearing this would be inspired and reach out.
Well, thanks so much, Lisa, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter, for now, at Josh L. Milburn, or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast on iTunes or wherever you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.